Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Nick Windsor. I'm president of this institution this year, the Institution of Engineering and Technology. We've been long-standing members and supporters of the Campaign for Science and Engineering, and I'd like to thank them immediately for organising this event tonight with such an eminent speaker, but more of that to come. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to Savoy Place, which has been the home of the IET since 1909. And I don't know how often, this audience would have come here. I guess we've got quite a few members of the IET here, but you'll see that we've done some marvellous work on this, refurbishing it in recent years, and I hope you'll enjoy the lovely surroundings you're in tonight, very historic surroundings too. I'd like to start by just telling you a little bit about the IET. We never miss an opportunity to just publicise what the IET does. We're one of the world's oldest engineering institutions, dating back to 1871. We believe we're a trusted, independent and professional engineering body. We have more than 168,000 members spread across 150 countries, and we're one of the largest professional engineering institutions in the world. Just focusing on the probable makeup of the audience tonight, we've always extended a very warm welcome to academic and student members in engineering-related fields of study or teaching. And we feel we have a great deal to offer you in terms of knowledge and resources. Just a quick advert for all of the great stuff we do. We provide lots of resources. We have 200,000 journal and conference proceeding papers with an archive dating back to 1872. We have a catalogue of e-books, print and textbooks that members can download and share with colleagues. We have more than 9,000 video presentations. Ours is the world's largest online archive of engineering and technology videos. We have a digital library which provides access to all of our content online, and a great abstract and indexing database which contains 17 million abstracts with a very modern sort of search engine. But the IET is not just about accessing all of those resources, it's about opening doors. Every year we create a range of opportunities for people to get together and network with engineers both from your own area of expertise and other disciplines. And obviously with that comes a great opportunity to enhance your knowledge and grow your personal network. We host events and training courses that can support you both in the journey towards gaining professional qualifications and in the course of continuous professional development. We like to think of ourselves as a professional home for life that will benefit your career and all stages of your career and beyond. So in summary on the IET, it's very important to us that we recruit strongly from the academic and student membership. We know that by expanding the breadth of our membership, we can bring the greatest benefit of shared knowledge to all of our members. We want to help engineer a better world for all generations, and we recognise that our academic and student members play a big part in helping us to achieve this. I hope I've given you a flavour of what the IET is all about for those that don't know us well, and an insight into the many benefits of membership. And now, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to just say a few words about tonight's lecture from an IET perspective, because we have talked to our members about how we feel about the topic, but in particular the bearing of Brexit on that. Of course, the subject for tonight's CaSE lecture, Britain's Place in the World, is certainly timely. I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling that we're living through a sort of nightmarish deal or no deal game show at the moment. The stakes are very high, and we're not even really sure what's in the boxes that are on the table. It is clearly the case that the prolonged uncertainty surrounding this issue is a cause for concern amongst many scientists, engineers, academics and researchers, and the IET strongly shares those concerns. The UK has a global reputation for excellence in science and engineering, as you all know very well. And it's this reputation that attracts the brightest and best from around the world to work and study in the UK. The UK's decision to leave the EU presents a challenge to maintain this level of excellence. And that's a big worry for all of us just at the moment, because the world-renowned excellence of the UK in these areas is vital to the UK economy. Just looking at engineering, it's estimated that engineering-related sectors contribute at least 20% of the UK's gross value add. They account for half of the UK's exports too. And we believe that at the heart of the matter is a question of skills. It's no secret that UK engineering is experiencing a skills crisis. In fact, it's estimated that we need 182,000 new engineers and technicians every year until 2022. And that's a very significant increase in what we're managing at the moment. It takes many years to fully train qualified engineers, and there's a crisis in terms of engineering skills right now. Linked to the question of skills, the question of mobility, which is another huge area of concern for our members. Engineering has a particularly internationally mobile workforce. It's reflected in academia, industry, and across all skill levels. For example, compared to the average of all subjects, UK university engineering departments have a higher proportion of international researchers and staff, as well as students. Furthermore, the UK's engineering sector is highly dependent on non-UK nationals. This is backed up by online surveys carried out by the Engineering the Future organisation earlier this year. 60% of respondents said their organisation was somewhat, very, or highly dependent on recruiting employees from the EU. But the political reality of leaving the EU means there are likely to be some restrictions on free movement of labour. So as we see it, when access to the European engineering workforce becomes more restricted, this may well, if negotiations don't well, exacerbate the existing crisis. That's why we urge the UK and the EU to strike a reasonable deal as soon as possible. We believe that that will provide security and certainty for businesses and citizens alike, both in the UK and the EU. The majority of our members consider no deal to be the worst possible scenario. Many have expressed serious concerns about the potential for there to be no deal, not just from the point of view of trade tariffs, but also the potential impact on issues like aviation standards, regulations, energy supply, and research and development programs. Looking ahead to a post-Brexit world, it's clear that science and engineering must continue to play a critical role in the growth of the UK economy, and we have a massive potential role in increasing the productivity of the UK and the provision, therefore, of high-value employment for a large section of society. For that to be able to happen, the UK must remain outward-looking and continue to be a leading player in international business, innovation, and academic communities. It's important, therefore, that science and engineering communities take advantage of what opportunities there will be post-Brexit. In order for these opportunities to be realised and shared across society, we will need to work closely with government and to help shape the strategic direction for the UK economy, followed by our exit from the EU. In particular, we share Engineering the Future's and CaSE's view that the principles for UK immigration system should encourage and not impede the ability of UK organisations to attract people with the experience, expertise and skills they need. And that's why we back Engineering the Future's assertion that new immigration policies must be simple and proportionate for applicants and employees alike, make intra-company transfers easy, provide certainty to talented students, academics and practicing engineers about opportunities to study and work in the UK, and enhance the support available to UK students, academics and practicing engineers to gain international experience, which, I for one have benefited hugely from in my career. And that needs to include the opportunity to get international experience in the EU. All of this is a tall order, but the science and engineering communities do need to get the government to sit up and listen to what they're saying, because the clock is ticking and time is running out on this issue. So that's our view from the IET. But of course, now I shall hand over to Dr. Sarah Main, Executive Director of CaSE, to introduce a much more relevant view on these matters and introduce tonight's speaker to give that view. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the CaSE annual lecture. My name's Sarah Main. Thank you to Nick Windsor, the president of the IET, for that introduction. It's such a pleasure to see so many CaSE members and friends here this evening who we know really well. Welcome to all of you. We are really thrilled to be able to hold our lecture here in this beautiful lecture theatre. So I would like to thank Nick Windsor and the Institution for the Engineering and Technology for their generosity in hosting us here tonight, and to their team for working with us for making the event run so smoothly. Just one other quick thanks now to Elsevier, who are our main sponsors for this evening, so thank you to them too. I have some duties to do before we get to the interesting bit, and the first one is about the fire safety. So we are not planning on to test your fire evacuation skills this evening. So if the alarms do sound continuously, we will need to evacuate. The nearest fire exits are behind you in those two corners. Please make your way to the main entrance or the east and west fire doors and congregate under Waterloo Bridge. If we do that, I'm sure Hilary Benn will continue his talk under Waterloo Bridge, and it'll be fascinating. So the event is being live streamed tonight. So welcome to all of you joining us online. Thank you very much. I hope you're comfortable at home. Whether you're in the theatre or watching online, everyone can join in the debate on Twitter using the hashtag CaseLecture17. So please do contribute. But please also, if you're in the theatre, put your phone on to silent. I can't say turn it off anymore, but we used to say just turn it off, but we're not allowed to do that now. But put it on silent. A recording is being made and will be available on the CaSE website sometime after the event. So as many of you know, the Campaign for Science and Engineering has been running for over 30 years, we can say. Some of you might have been at our 30th anniversary lecture last year, so you'll know we've now been going for 31 years. And our mission is to ensure the UK has the skills, funding and policies to enable science and engineering to thrive. And every one of our members supports us in that mission. We have many, many hundreds of individual members, thank you to all of you, and we have around 100 organisational members, including the IET, and they span academia, industry, charities, and trade unions, research institutes, and a number of others. So collectively, our members employ 360,000 people in the UK, and our industry and charity members invest around £35 billion a year globally in R&D. If you would like to be part of the campaign and contribute to our voice, then please do talk to one of us this evening or have a look at the leaflets that are around. So now on to the actual talk. I'm delighted to introduce to you this evening the Right Honourable Hilary Benn MP to give our annual lecture on Britain's place in the world. Elected as Member of Parliament for Leeds Central in 1999, Hilary Benn served in a number of high-profile positions in subsequent Labour governments, including as International Development Secretary and Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which he was telling us just a little bit about before we started. Following the 2010 election, Hilary's parliamentary experience saw him appointed Shadow Leader of the House, Shadow Communities and Local Government Secretary, and then Shadow Foreign Secretary in 2015. In October of 2016, he was elected to his current role as Chair of the Exiting the European Union Select Committee, the Commons' leading committee for scrutiny of Brexit. I will say only a few words on the topic of Brexit. The UK's referendum vote to leave the EU affects us all as citizens, but as a community here this evening of scientists and engineers, of course it affects our work as a research and innovation endeavour. Not only is science the second largest recipient of EU funds after agriculture, but it benefits from the structures that have been built up over many years with the European Union for collaboration, for sharing expertise and facilities, regulation, trade and market access, as we all know. Even this week, relocation of the European Medicines Agency out of London gives just one powerful illustration, the consequences of which will take many years to fully be felt. So, as Chair of the Committee for Exiting the EU, Hilary Benn will offer his insight from the heart of politics into the UK's journey through Brexit and its ramifications for the UK and the EU. He will be able to reflect on how the UK can seek to establish anew its place in the world and give his perspective for us on the role of our scientific standing in that task. So please do join me now in giving a warm welcome to the Right Honourable Hilary Benn, MP.
Nick, Sarah, first of all, thank you very much for that kind introduction and also for pointing out where the fire exits are, although I must confess I fear there is no Brexit exit currently available. I also want to thank all of you for coming along here this evening to the Institution of Engineering and Technology. As always happens when I come here, all of us, we pass, of course, the famous statue of Michael Faraday, whose legendary exchange with Gladstone when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer proved that scientists are often ahead of politicians in inventing things that can later be taxed. I would also like to begin by paying tribute to CaSE for all of the work and campaigning that you've done over many years on behalf of British science and engineering. Now, I am old enough to remember CaSE before it was CaSE. The trade union that I worked for as a young researcher, ASTMS, was an enthusiastic supporter of Save British Science. Now, it is sometimes said in diplomacy that the UK punches above its weight on the world stage. Now, whether that is true or not, and it's not been a good week, the EU agencies leaving London for Paris and Amsterdam, the UK losing a seat on the International Court of Justice for the first time ever, it is certainly true when it comes to CaSE. With modest resources, you have consistently, over the years, demonstrated both scientific leadership and the ability to work cooperatively with the wider scientific and engineering community. To take one example, as MPs were coming out of the chamber yesterday trying to understand what the implications of the budget were, CaSE had already produced a detailed briefing on the implications for science and engineering. And with those qualities comes influence. Every science minister, some of whom you have invited to give this lecture in previous years, comes to learn very quickly that they better pay very close attention to what CaSE has to say. And in the past years, you've also heard from ministers and shadow ministers and also from some very distinguished former chief scientific advisors, some of whom I worked with as a cabinet minister as we grappled with the relationship between science and politics. But I have not come here tonight, you'll be glad to hear, to talk about badger culling. I also want to say to all of you and to all of your colleagues a thank you for the work that you do, not only because it is so valuable in itself, that spirit of inquiry, but because of the fruits of your efforts have shaped and transformed the world in ways that frankly would astonish our forebears and our ancestors. And may I encourage all of you to keep it up. Now, for these reasons, it is a great privilege to have been invited to give this lecture tonight and to reflect on Britain's future and the place of science and engineering within it. Ours is an age in which people are seeking certainty. But there is only one thing we can be sure of. These are very, very uncertain times. The world, our politics, is in a state of flux. So let us begin by being honest with each other. This is quite disconcerting for society, including, I suspect, for scientists and engineers who many people think like facts, robust evidence, systems that work, measurements that add up, structure and order. But of course, you also are well used to investigating the things we do not know and the things we do not yet understand in order to improve the stock of human knowledge. As one of your distinguished predecessors, Sarah, once said, science is more about plotting a path through uncertainty. And heaven knows, do we need that now? Some of what is happening is the continuing fallout from the global financial crash of a decade ago, a crash which shook not only our financial institutions, but also our politics, our economies, and our societies. It has produced an alienation and a frustration in some with the status quo, both here in the United Kingdom and beyond our shores. At the same time, technological advances, smartphones, social media, automation, AI, are having a profoundly disruptive influence too. No wonder everywhere people talk of the fourth industrial revolution. Now, these advances have changed the way in which information is produced and shared and digested. Ideas can spread in seconds. Anyone can now be a publisher and produce news, fake or otherwise. Powerful forces have been unleashed. And as the Prime Minister said last week, we have seen how Russia has sought to influence politics here, and it is said in the United States, by fueling division and discord and creating uncertainty through Twitter bots and Photoshop. But before we get too righteous, we should remember that they are not the first government in history to have tried to do so. We are only just beginning to understand the way in which social media can be used and manipulated, the way in which algorithms now take decisions that affect all of our lives. And I'm glad that Parliament is now beginning to look at that as the Science and Technology Committee has started its inquiry into algorithms in decision-making. Now, thanks to also to these new technologies, people can now see what life is like elsewhere on the globe, including what democracy, the rule of law, stability, economic prosperity can bring. Although some countries, precisely because they understand the power of these technologies, have taken steps to restrict the access of their public to the internet. Take a look at the Arab Spring. People rose up to challenge existing structures and rulers in a way that would previously have been unthinkable. Tragically, the early democratic hopes of many were soon dashed, and we have seen a wave of turmoil and bloody sectarian and religious conflict in the region that continues to this day, the consequences of which do not stop at their borders or ours. From the migration crisis, the men who get into those leaky boats on the shores of North Africa prepared to risk their lives in search of a better future in Europe, to the global terrorist threat. And we know from history that at times like these, it is the populists who prosper. Populists whose answer to the problems of the world is always the same. It is to blame someone else. And in so doing, they fan the flames of prejudice. And we must stand together against the siren voices of those who make this argument, because their politics is destructive and it offers no answer at all to the challenges that we face in the world. The idea that at this moment, of all times in human history, we can somehow choose to shut the doors and close the curtains and get into bed and pull up the covers and wish that everyone and everything would just go away is both to deny our shared humanity, but also to deprive ourselves of the very means by which we can do something about these problems, which is working together as peoples and nations. Now, these are the very arguments that dominated the debate about Britain's place in the European Union. I was a passionate Remainer. I remain a passionate Remainer. Not because I think the European Union is perfect, far from it, but because above all other reasons, it has achieved something quite remarkable. Arising from the ashes of the Second World War, 6 of the countries that had fought each other in that war and in countless other wars in the preceding centuries, they came together to create the European Coal and Steel Community. Its founders resolved to make a return to conflict on the continent of Europe, in the words of the Schuman Declaration, not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. And their vision was the most powerful and the most enduring memorial that we could have hoped to build to the flower of 2 generations of young Europeans who gave their lives in war in the 20th century and who now rest eternal in those immaculately cared for graves. And it is, for me, as I'm sure it is for you, the inscriptions on those gravestones, their names, their ages, the unknown, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God, because no one knew then or knows to this day whose brother or son or uncle or cousin lies in those immaculately cared for cemeteries. And their gravestones call upon us, the post-war generation, to do everything in our power to prevent such slaughter from happening again. And their hope has, of course, on this continent, our continent, be fulfilled. The 28 countries of the European Union have been at peace, although the conviction of General Ratko Mladic this week for his involvement in the worst genocide in Europe since the Second World War reminds us that we can never take peace for granted, even close to home. A union of 28 free democracies working together has proved what human beings can achieve when we choose to replace conflict with cooperation and enmity with dialogue. A union that has brought prosperity and founded the world's largest single economic market. A union that helps protect security and has made us amongst the most stable and safest countries in the world in which to live. Indeed, if all of humankind could cooperate and trade and work together as the nations of the European Union have done, then there would be more peace, more prosperity, and more progress on this earth. And of course, it has given Britain a stronger voice in the world, a point I will return to later on. And yet, for all of these arguments and many, many others that we, as Remainers, made in the referendum, we lost. And that's the thing about democracy. Sometimes you lose. It's painful. It's hard. But we have no choice but to accept the outcome of the referendum, notwithstanding the sense of shock felt by many, including in the science and engineering community. After all, you live and breathe the importance of international collaboration, as we all woke up on that Friday morning to discover that the United Kingdom had voted to leave. When the Article 50 bill was being debated in Parliament, many people urged us as MPs not to vote for it. They said, it's only an advisory referendum. It was only 37% of the electorate. They said that people had been misled, and that, as we now know, is true. But I think they missed the most important point. If Parliament at that moment had turned round to the 52% who voted to leave and said, you didn't know what you were doing. We know better than you. We're just going to ignore the outcome of the referendum. The only thing we would have achieved would have been to empower and embolden the populists. They would have said, I told you. The establishment would never accept the result, and the consequences could have been explosive. And frankly, we have a big enough problem with populists today, from the Front National in France, the AfD in Germany, and some folk across the Atlantic Ocean, without giving them a helping hand. So as we seek to respond to the referendum result, we have to understand why it happened. We have to understand, because if we do not, how are we going to heal the division revealed by that result in a nation that was split almost exactly down the middle? How do we bring together the 52% and the 48%? And I think that as well as being about the EU and migration, the vote to leave was about a lot of other things as well. Inequality, austerity, loss, change, waiting too long to see the GP, my child can't afford to buy a house, alienation, identity, a belief that somehow our country had given up that which had made us great. But above all, it was a search for control in a world in which, for many people, precisely because of the pace of change, it seems that they have barely any control at all. Now, I say that because we have to address those concerns that have nothing to do with the European Union, but that would be the subject of an entirely different lecture. So, what do we need to do now? Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that we're leaving the institutions of the European Union at the end of March 2019. That's what the referendum decided. However, it did not decide what our future relationship is going to be with our 27 friends and neighbours, who will remain our 27 27 friends and neighbours after we have left. It did not decide whether we stay in the customs union or the single market. It did not decide whether we should give up on cooperation on foreign policy, defence, security, the fight against terrorism. It did not decide whether we should abandon collaboration in science and engineering, or working together to regulate medicines, or cooperating to certify that new aircraft and air engines are safe. Every one of these issues will have a profound effect on our country's future and on Britain's place in the world. It is now for us to shape and determine that future. And be in no doubt, if we leave the European Union without a deal for Britain and a strong future relationship with our European neighbours, then it is our citizens who will pay the greatest price. So the question we are wrestling with is quite simply this: what shape should this new relationship with Europe take, and how do we secure it, given the current state of the negotiations, as we wait to see whether more money being offered will unlock talks on that future relationship at the European Council meeting in December? Now, what will this mean for science and engineering? First of all, for people. For the 3 million European citizens working here and the 1.2 million Brits working in the other member states, the result of the referendum was a great shock. I remember meeting 6 weeks after the referendum a young research scientist from Spain at the House of Commons who told me how she had been shouted at in the street to go home by someone who thought the referendum result meant that they could now do this. And to make matters worse, speeches were made that gave the impression that people who come to this country from elsewhere were a bit of a problem, or they might be used as bargaining chips. Now, this created a great deal of anxiety for people who have chosen to make this country their home, who've worked hard in our universities and our research laboratories and our companies, and who pay their taxes and raise their families and put down roots as our neighbours. And they too now are seeking certainty. Now, in your world, it's the best minds that make the UK such a global force. I'm told that the most cited pieces of research tend to be those that have been undertaken as a result of international collaboration. So attracting and retaining world-class staff and attracting more talent is not only important for our universities and the research sectors, but is crucial for the future of the British economy, given the huge strategic importance of science and engineering. That's why the Brexit Select Committee, in its second report, the only report we produced unanimously, said that the United Kingdom should make a unilateral commitment to safeguard the rights of EU nationals living here and not to put them into the negotiations. Now, the government did not do that, although I have no doubt that the 3 million will all be able to stay, no doubt at all. And the government has indeed since announced it's designing a new system for EU citizens to make applications online for the proposed settled status. Now, that is welcome, but we need to know how it's going to work in practice, given the scale of the task, when you pause to contemplate it, of documenting 3 million people when the Home Office doesn't know who some of them are because of the way in which we operated free movement. What remains is whether those with settled status will continue to be able to bring their families here and how the agreement is going to be overseen. The next question is to ensure that a future immigration system after Brexit allows talent to continue to come into the UK and for UK-based staff to be able to work elsewhere in Europe, rather than seeing a return to the brain drain of the past, which is one of the things that Save British Science used to campaign about. Now, the Financial Times reported recently that David Davis had promised bankers a special post-Brexit regime to allow them to move freely across Europe. I would simply say if he can offer that insurance to those in financial services, I see no reason at all why it shouldn't also be offered to scientists and engineers. The CBI has found that 4 out of 10 UK firms have difficulties currently in recruiting staff with skills in science, technology, engineering and mathematics. The government should be making their lives easier in trying to recruit people with those skills and not harder. And if the UK's future immigration system includes some kind of minimum income threshold, while bankers may not find that much of a hurdle, some scientists and researchers with skills that we really, really need in this country might struggle to make it here. Now, ministers need to reassure all of us that this will not be the case, and that also it is their firm intention to remain part of the Erasmus student exchange programme after we leave, because I think that would send a powerful signal that the UK wants to remain a connected nation and a world leader in higher education, as well as giving my constituents, particularly those who come from low-income backgrounds, the chance, when they go to university, to go and study elsewhere in Europe. And while I'm at it, it is frankly ridiculous that the government continues to insist on including students in its net migration target. People coming here to study, to undertake research and build networks are good for our economy and for Britain's standing in the world. They are not a number to be reduced. Now, this is just part of a wider conversation that we need to have about immigration. Just reflect for a moment on the greatest social challenge we face as a country, the demographic time bomb, which will see the number of people aged 65 and over rise by nearly 5 million in the next 2 decades. Already, 1 in 5 of our care workers come from outside the United Kingdom, from Europe and the rest of the world. And we will need more carers, as more people need looking after. Remember, first it's our grandparents, then it's our mums and dads, and although it may not seem like it yet to some of you looking at the audience, we're going to be next at some point. And when my father came to the end of his life, most of the people who cared for him with such patience and gentleness had come from abroad to make Britain their home and to offer their skill in care. So as well as providing the care, we will also need to pay for it. And that is why the economic contribution of those who come to this country to work is so important, as are the taxes that they pay. The truth is that leaving the European Union is not going to stop immigration. Our economy will continue to need it. And the fundamental to the strength of that British economy is the freedom to bring in new talent and creative minds from abroad, as well as draw on the huge homegrown reservoir of those same skills and talents to build new businesses and employ workers in Britain who can then buy goods and services from firms in Britain. Now, we have lived with migration for centuries. Think about it. From the Romans to the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, from the Jews fleeing persecution to the Irish fleeing famine, from the Windrush generation, those who came from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh to work in the mills and manufacturing, to their present-day equivalents, from Poland, Lithuania and Romania, and even, I would add, some Americans, being the proud son of an immigrant to this country from Ohio, my mum. And one of the greatest things about our country is the way in which over generations these successive waves of migrants have mixed and melded and married until it is almost impossible to untangle the threads of the journeys that brought them here in the first place. But it doesn't mean that any of us, because I talked about identity earlier, it doesn't mean that any of us, whether born in Britain or born abroad, feel any less who we think ourselves to be. We are proud of who we are. English, Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish, British, European, American, French. And in that very British way, we get along. Next, research. When he recently came to give evidence to the Select Committee, David Davis said, "It is quite likely we will continue to participate in Horizon 2020. We will formalise that before December." Well, that's not very long. Now, we as a Select Committee have already called on the government to make this commitment. It matters. You know that. Researchers in the UK have secured €3.6 billion in funding through Horizon 2020 since 2014. 1 in 6 Horizon 2020 projects are coordinated by the UK. Not only does the programme serve to encourage partnerships that help underpin the UK's global reputation for research, it has a prestige that, let's be honest, a UK-only fund would be unable to match. So ministers should now state firmly, OK, I'll give you till next month, that the UK intends to remain part of Horizon 2020 and its successor programmes. But even with the current EU investment in the UK, as you know also, the UK lags behind other nations when it comes to the percentage of our GDP that we spend on R&D, less than 1.9% compared to the OECD average of 2.4%, and behind countries like Germany, Japan, and the USA. So if we are going to compete globally after Brexit, then we need to invest more in R&D. After all, for every pound spent by government, private sector output rises by 20 pence a year in perpetuity by raising the level of the UK knowledge base. This investment is vitally important for a healthy and successful science and engineering sector. And what about our participation in other institutions and the implications for regulatory stability? Now, even though the European Medicines Agency is leaving the UK, we cannot afford to let it also mean that London loses its status as a focal point for medical research and technology. We have a big decision to make. Can we remain part of the EMA? If we're not, are we just going to mirror the decisions they take about the certification of new drugs? Or are we going to set up a completely new certification and approval system at huge expense? And you know, we're going to face this choice with over 50 European agencies that we are currently part of. And one of the things about the Brexit debate is that so far, I'm afraid the government has given the impression it'll all be fine, we can keep the stuff we like while we get rid of the stuff we can't. I would simply make this point. The government has made choices about the approach it wants to take, customs union, single market, ECJ, and there are consequences to those choices. Consequences we are already beginning to see today, the news that Leeds, Dundee and others who were bidding to be a European capital of culture in 2023 have been told by the Commission, inexplicably, 17 months after the referendum result, they could have told us earlier that we will no longer be able to participate in that programme after people had put their bids in, got their hopes up. But it's a consequence of Brexit. Similarly, whatever relationship the government wants to pursue with Euratom in future, and I still don't understand why ministers wanted to leave, although if it's true that it fell foul of the Prime Minister's red line on the European Court of Justice, then frankly, words fail me. It is essential that this decision does not reduce our ability to take part in collaborative research or pursue international cooperation in the civil nuclear industry in future. And if we look, say, at the chemical sector, as Steve Elliott, the Chief Executive of the Chemical Industries Association, said in evidence to the committee, our industry is highly regulated, and it has to be, in order to give assurance. Chemical businesses in the UK will be grateful for any certainty and continuity, the search for certainty. And of course, we mustn't forget the European Research Council, the European Space Agency programs like Galileo and Copernicus. Mind you, how could we possibly forget when every person who now arrives at Terminal 5 is greeted by a giant picture of Tim Peake, who is described as a European astronaut. Now, throughout the negotiations, we have heard all too many ministers repeatedly say, no deal is better than a bad deal. No deal is better than a bad deal. This is nonsense. No deal is a bad deal. No deal is the worst possible deal you could get. I don't often agree with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, but earlier this year he said, no deal would be a very, very bad outcome for the United Kingdom. He was right. And the proof of that is to be found in the government's belated decision to seek a transitional arrangement, or as they call it, an implementation period. Now, I don't mean to be picky, but if you're having an implementation period, presumably you have something to implement. It's precisely because we haven't yet got anything to implement that we need a transition period to negotiate a deal which we can then implement. But anyway, leave that on one side. We need a transitional arrangement if we're going to avoid the possibility of driving off the edge of the famous cliff that everybody is talking about. And as the laws of gravity have long shown, doing that is, generally speaking, not a very good idea. But we need to get on with getting this transitional agreement, because the Chancellor of the Exchequer has also rightly described it as a wasting asset. The benefits diminish the longer it takes to agree one. We urgently need to get the rules agreed so that everyone, including the scientific community, know where they stand. because we should not be surprised when some businesses start to put into effect their plans to relocate activities and people to continental Europe because they cannot take the risk of negotiations ending in failure. Now, all of this, negotiating Brexit, working out what the implications will be for almost every area of our national life, every university, research institution, business, every community necessarily is taking up a huge amount of time for ministers, for civil servants, and for Parliament, not to mention the Brexit Select Committee. And does this mean that we will have less time to think about Britain's place in the world? Well, I have to say to you, I fear it does. Our great country is one of the most successful in human history. We are a small group of islands off the north coast of Europe. We have less than 1% of the world's population. We are its sixth biggest economy and generate 4% of GDP. Our language is spoken by 1.5 billion worldwide. Our literature, our theatre, our films, our actors are loved the world over. Our universities attract the brightest and the best. We have more Nobel laureates per head of population than the United States, Germany or China. British broadcasters are respected in all four corners of the globe for their impartial reporting, although not necessarily in the West Wing of the White House. And we have helped to influence and shape the modern world through the power of ideas and values, our system of governance, parliamentary democracy, the rule of national and international law, and the belief that every human being has rights that are inalienable, ideas that are a beacon of inspiration to people who enjoy none of these things. Now, all of this came about not by turning our backs on others. It came to pass because we embraced others. We travelled, we traded, we built alliances, were open to new ideas and welcomed new people. Britain's story, our unique history as an island nation, has been shaped by how we have looked beyond our shores and sought out the wider world. And because we did so, Britain is not only a successful country, but an influential one. Now, less than a mile from this building here is another building that was an important part of that journey, because 71 years ago, on the 17th of January 1946, the United Nations Security Council met for the very first time in Church House with Britain as one of its permanent members. A week earlier, in Central Hall, Westminster, just across the road, the UN General Assembly held its inaugural meeting. Now, these and other great institutions fashioned in the aftermath of the Second World War were a conscious effort to establish a new world order, to build something better in that generation than what the world had experienced in the 1920s and the 1930s. A world order which I am sad to say some are now seeking to undermine or even destroy, whether by rejecting the science underpinning climate change or claiming that working with others somehow impinges upon and constrains our sovereignty. What does it mean to be sovereign in the modern world? Some claim we have lost absolute sovereignty and that Brexit is an opportunity now to regain it. They're wrong. We've always been a sovereign nation. A sovereign British Parliament joined the Common Market in 1973. A sovereign British people voted to remain in the Common Market in 1975. A sovereign House of Commons respected the result of the June 2016 referendum. And a sovereign House of Commons, not just the government, by the way, will decide on what our future relationship with the European Union will be. Why do we aspire to sovereignty? Because we understand that it gives us some influence and some control. Leaving the union of 28 European nations is not going to enhance our sovereignty. Instead, it risks weakening our influence in the world. Because what strengthens us is being connected to other nations and building relationships with them, sharing our sovereignty with others to our mutual benefit. Now, of course, as in any relationship, sometimes you get what you want and other times you don't. It's a bit like families, but having a whacking great argument is not a case for walking away, because together we are better off. And the truth is that Britain originally gained influence as a nation through military strength, the Industrial Revolution, and the Empire. But in the second half of the 20th century, we came to realize that it was far better and far more effective to be a global power that achieved its goals through cooperation, participation, rather than conquest. Dean Acheson famously observed in 1962, "Great Britain has lost an empire, but not yet found a role." And today we have a similar challenge confronting us. Because that conscious decision to exchange hard power for soft power was an enormously courageous step to take, because it meant giving up the means by which we had prospered in the past. But it paid off, and we took that step in part because of the bitter experience of war, and in part because we could hear the inexorable end of the age of empire coming in the growing cry for freedom from our colonies. And so it was that their submission at our hands gave way to their self-determination as the winds of change blew away the old order and a new world emerged. It was on the 14th of August 1941 that Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt met on a ship in Newfoundland to adopt a joint declaration that later became known as the Atlantic Charter, that set out the Allied goals for the post-war world that became the basis for the United Nations. And the two most important of those goals were, first, self-determination so that people could be free to shape their own future, and second, global cooperation to secure better economic and social conditions for all, the foundation of the post-war order that was built with the United Nations and the World Bank, the IMF and other institutions. And far from being in contradiction, what bound these two goals together was the dawning realization that for states to truly determine their future in the modern age, they would have to cooperate with their neighbours and with the rest of the world. So the question is, how can we best advance the British national interest today and in the future? And the answer is by continuing to do exactly that, by continuing to participate in and lead those very organisations that we helped to create, which gave and give us influence. Influence that can be seen today in many, many different ways, from the European Convention on Human Rights, which we helped to draft, to British standards, which allow us to have confidence in the quality of goods and services, from UK leadership in humanitarian aid. The UN Central Emergency Response Fund was a British idea, to the first climate change act in the world. And when you think of the state of our world at the beginning of the 21st century, what is the one word that sums up the human condition? Well, for me, the word is interdependence. Interdependence. The world I was born into in the year of the Queen's coronation had a population of about 2.7 billion people. It's now 7.5, something like that. By the time my two grandsons reach my age, they will be sharing this small and fragile planet with 10 billion men, women, and children. And I think this century will be defined, first of all, by how we deal with the movement of people. People fleeing war and persecution. Look at the impact that the civil war in Syria has had in that country and on its neighbours. People fleeing the effects of climate change. Make absolutely no mistake, if it stops raining in some places and it rains too much in other places, people are not going to hang about to starve or die of thirst or to drown. They're going to move in search of safety and a better life, as human beings have done throughout the whole course of human history. 140 million Bangladeshis live, well, probably 1.5 times the height of the ceiling of this wonderful lecture theatre above sea level. If sea levels rise in the way in which some scientists predict, they're moving house. They'll probably move next door to India. And thirdly, the movement of people in search of a better life. So why is the argument for the development of all countries so powerful? You read some newspapers now in Britain, oh, we're spending too much money on the aid budget. This is all wasted, terrible. We should just look after ourselves. The answer is very simple, and I learned that in my 4 years as the Development Secretary, because every person should have the right. Every person should be able to grow up safe, get an education, receive health care, get a job, raise a family in the land in which they were born, if that is what they wish. Not only is it the moral thing to do, it is also in our self-interest, which, by the way, is not the same as selfishness. And the second great challenge is how do we deal with and reconcile the two great forces that Churchill and Roosevelt identified, and which are in tension with each other like tectonic plates. On the one hand, the cry, and we hear it everywhere, for devolution, sovereignty, control, call it what you will, that springs from a desire to have more say about what happens in our lives and in our communities. And on the other hand, the recognition that we have to cooperate together as peoples and as nations if we're going to deal with the challenges which the world faces and make the most of the opportunities that the future presents us with. Britain's influence in the world, Britain's place in the world, will be determined more than anything else by the relationships we forge with others. And as we embrace that future, as we know we must, science and engineering will be to the fore. Vanquishing disease, battling climate change, cleaning up our oceans and our air, creating the next generation of technologies, exploring the universe, and seeking answers to the questions that still perplex, and making the most of our human ingenuity and our astonishing ability to transform the gifts that the earth has given us into those medicines, those materials, those technologies, those rockets, and that understanding which will change the future. I am in politics because I am an optimist, because I believe that when our time is done, and we all have a finite term on this earth, we can bequeath something better to our children and our grandchildren. And I know the same is true of you. So as Clem Attlee said, when he faced the great challenge of rebuilding our country at the end of the Second World War, let us face the future. And in that spirit, I urge you to play your full part in shaping that future too. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Keep banging those, sorry.
I invite you to come in.
Oh, I'm going to come and sit down, sorry.
Thank you very much. Oh, it's on. Oh, good. Thank you so much. I've got a feeling you might have earned yourself a few fans in the room. Did you enjoy that? I think they did. It's one of the reasons I was really keen to invite you to speak for us this year was that the Campaign for Science and Engineering quite often invites people to speak to us from our own community, and I thought it was a really good time and also a person with a really good insight to share an external view of what the scientific community, its place in this bigger landscape that you've set. So I'm going to invite questions from the audience. So I hope you've all thought of some good questions. I'll probably take them in groups of 2 or 3, and I think we've got maybe about half an hour for questions, if that's all right. I might just start off with one, which I imagine maybe some people in the audience are thinking. I mean, from where you sit in the committee, you will have seen people make representation from all parts of UK society and the economy. We in the audience, we all think science is pretty important and is, probably the only thing anyone should be interested in, and so on. But how does it feel to you from your perspective? You've talked in a compelling way about the role of science in our kind of wider national interest, but from a political point of view and sitting in that committee, seeing witnesses come and go, what's your sense on the receiving end of the place that it's playing within the wider other voices that you're hearing?
Well, can you hear me if I... Oh, do I need to hold the mic? Yeah. Well, there is a cacophony of voices seeking to talk about Brexit. And it's a great challenge for any government, including this one. The advice I would give is very simply this. Don't be backward about coming forward, because now is the moment. Because there are lots of people with different interests, different things that they think are important. So my advice is identify what are the most important things, and I've met a lot of people, including you, Sarah, and a lot of people from universities and companies involved in engineering. And I always say, okay, so what's the most important thing for you? The difficulty at the moment is we are stuck on part one of the negotiations, structured that way by the European Union because it wants to sort the money, it wants to sort the citizens, which will be sorted. There's a really, really tricky problem in Northern Ireland because there is an incompatibility, if I may put it that way, between leaving the customs union and the single market on the one hand and saying there'll be absolutely no border in Northern Ireland whatsoever. And the reason the talks are in difficulty is because no one can yet see how that particular circle can be squared. And I know that many of you and the institutions that you work in will have made representations to the relevant government departments. And I think at the start of the process, the Department for Exiting the EU said to every government department, go away, talk to your stakeholders, come back and tell us what are the three most important things in your sector, and we're going to have to work out how we can fit them into the negotiations, not knowing at that time, which is, 17 months ago, that we would be here towards the end of November 2017, still not moving on to the negotiations about our future relationship, because this Article 50 process is in two parts, the divorce and the future relationship. And I don't think a final deal on trade, what we might get on the single market or might not, is going to be completed within 12 months. I've met no one, apart from government ministers, who think it will. That's going to move into the detail will move into the transition period, which is one of the reasons why it is so important. So make your argument, make sure it is heard. It's certainly been heard by the Select Committee, as I tried to point out when I told you about some of the recommendations we've already made. So you've clearly done a good job as far as that's concerned.
Thank you. Does anyone have any initial questions? Raise your hand. Okay, I can see one. I'm looking for two or three. Come on, surely. Okay. So we're going to have Mike over here. Was that Stephen? Was that you in your hand? And a lady over there? Did I see a hand go up in that section? No? Okay, we'll start. We'll start with Mike and then Stephen.
Thanks. Mike Goldsworthy, scientist for EU. Question about the 58 secret Brexit studies in terms of timing and redaction. What happens now and how do things get decided? How is this going to move forward? Thanks.
I know you'll have a few things to say about that. And we'll go to Stephen.
Stephen Curry, I'm on the board of CaSE, but also from Imperial College. I would love to think there was a mechanism for Britain remaining within Horizon 2020 and access to the European Research Council, but that is completely predicated on commitment to freedom of movement, which is one of the pillars of the EU. And the Swiss found to their cost a few years ago when they broke the rules that they very soon lost access. So do you know something I don't about how these things might play out?
And the third question, I thought I saw over there. There we go. Okay, yes.
Hi there, my name is Sanjoy Sen. Just to say, first of all, thank you very much for a great speech. It's great to understand what the challenges are of leaving the European Union and your views on immigration going forward. But the title of the lecture was Britain's Place in the World. And unfortunately, at no point did we really hear from yourself what you felt Britain's place in the world and not Europe might actually relate to. Now, was there a specific reason to not address that? I was just wondering.
I thought you did it. I'm not entirely sure I agree with the question, but I'll let you have it.
I think that's a tad harsh, if I may say so, because I seem to remember talking about the United Nations. I referred to the International Monetary Fund and our relationship with America. I did talk about a number of things. Well, I could have gone on for a lot longer, but I was told that it shouldn't last more than 30 minutes, and I think it did. So I apologise if you are disappointed. Maybe you can come to another event and I'll try and address you specifically. But look, at the moment we are very preoccupied with Brexit for understandable reasons, because the fact we're leaving does impact upon the way we are seen by others in the world. When a crisis blows up, who is someone going to call first? Is it the European Union, or is it going to be the United Kingdom? Well, it depends what the crisis is. But look, I was very frank in saying I think this will undermine our influence in the world. That is one of the reasons I campaigned so hard for this decision not to be taken. But I was also making a plea for us to continue to be open. And by that I mean open to all countries of the world and not just those of Europe. Now, Stephen, on free movement, well, that remains to be seen. Look, the message that came from many of the 52% was a message about migration. I had many conversations with lots of people all over the country, including my constituents. They knew exactly how they were going to vote. And they would have said the morning after, I didn't think you lot were listening to us. You're listening now, aren't you? Because they had used their political power, their vote, to bring about a change which they passionately believed in. And in some cases, they were putting a belief, a feeling, above what you and I might regard as their immediate economic self-interest. If you're a Nissan car worker in Washington, Nissan came to invest in Britain to build cars to export them to Europe, and there's a potential risk, say, if we didn't get a deal, that those cars would be 10% more expensive. Why would you vote to leave the European Union? But some people did. And we should pay very, very close attention when people are who think that something else is more important than just economic self-interest, which most people might have said, well, that would be the basis on which people take their decision. Incidentally, we shouldn't be surprised if the European Union decides to put the unity of the 27 in these negotiations above what may be the immediate economic interest of some member states. We'll only see that unfold as the negotiations move on to phase 2. We have a fundamental choice to make about how we're going to deal with this question of free movement. Jonathan Portes has produced a very interesting paper pointing out that there's lots of things you can do within the current free movement rules that would be rather different to the very free and open system that we have operated as a country. We didn't have any transitional controls. The Home Office doesn't know who's in the country. If you go to Belgium as a Brit to exercise your free movement rights, you register with the commune, so they know you're there. We don't, which is why the documentation task is going to be so challenging. Mike, well, I could say I'm expecting a couple of Sainsbury's bags to arrive in the Select Committee office in the next few days. David Davis said in a statement to the House of Commons on the 7th of November, we expect this stuff to be handed over within 3 weeks, which, if it's 3 weeks from the 7th of November rather than the date on which the resolution was carried by the House, would be the 28th of November, so that's next week. I said very clearly in the correspondence that I sent him, which has been published and is available on our website as a select committee, we expect to get the material as it existed on the day the resolution was carried. The government's talked about updating it, and I've said, well, that's fine. Give us the original version and the updated version. And I also made it clear that it will be for the Select Committee to decide what to publish. But we also acknowledge that when it comes to material that would undermine our negotiations, material that is commercially confidential, well, I wouldn't argue that we should publish that. Indeed, our predecessor Select Committee said very clearly there should be openness, but we shouldn't publish anything that undermines the negotiations. Nobody would do it in those circumstances, but I was clear the committee would make that choice and not the government. So we will see. I suspect they won't be quite as exciting as some people anticipate. The government has made it clear they are sectoral analyses and not impact assessments. But I would just make this one other point. When I was a minister, when you were publishing a bill and white papers, and there was always an impact assessment where someone, mainly the economists in the department, had gone through and said this will happen and that might happen and so on and so forth. It is, frankly, extraordinary that for the biggest change in our country that we have faced, well, certainly since the end of the Second World War, with enormous economic implications depending on the outcome, not a single economic impact assessment has been done of the implications of that. Just to give one example, the government decided we're going to leave the customs union because we're going to negotiate wonderful free trade deals with lots of other countries. How's the deal with America going to go? I have my suspicions, because I know what America would like to sell to us, and America's negotiating strategy, generally speaking, is to say, here's the deal we're offering, come back to us when you're happy to accept what we've put on the table. I would have expected us to be able to discuss, well, what's the relative benefits of running the risk with the relationship we have with our biggest single export market, the 44% of our exports that go to the other 27 members of the European Union, compared to what we might eventually hope to gain. And the other thing I would say is, the way the argument's been presented, it's like you have to choose between selling to the EU and selling to the rest of the world. What is the largest single export market that the United Kingdom sells into in the world? It's the United States of America, 19% of our exports. Do we have a trade deal with the Americans? No, we don't. And all that proves is if you produce good stuff at the right price, people will buy it.
Thank you. I might just dwell on Stephen's question a little bit more. I think if I expand what I think he was getting at was that the notion of participating in Horizon 2020 and future frameworks has been widely understood by the scientific community to be, in quite a black and white way, completely dependent on the UK's acceptance of free movement. At least, that was a position. For my money, for what I've heard in conversations about this, it appears that there may be some flex around that, and I just wondered if you might want to say a bit more, because I think that's what Stephen was getting at. Am I right? Are you kind of getting at this kind of, is it a black and white line, or is there? Well,
just to be frank, I'm not clear that it is a black and white line, and if we think it's the right thing to do, and I do, and I'm sure you do too, then that is something we should pursue with vigour. And of course, what we have to offer the 27 member states is money in return for our participation. And the reason why money is such a big issue in the negotiation is our departure leaves a whacking great hole in the budget of the 27 member states. And that's why they structured the negotiations in the way they have, to try and secure as much of the money at the start before we move on to the negotiations. Although anyone, if we were negotiating, would try and keep the money to use it as leverage in return for a decent deal. Because the money is one card that we unquestionably have when all of the other cards are not entirely in our favour, because we're leaving and the clock's ticking. And that is a bit of a problem. So I think it remains to be seen. But the starting point, which is what I've been focusing on, encouraging the committee to do thus far, is to get the government to say, yeah, this is what we want to do. And as you heard me say, the sooner they do that, the better, because then you can start to find out whether it is a hard border, which says, no, you can't, or whether there could be some flexibility negotiated in mutual self-interest.
Hands up, any more questions? Okay, we've got lots now. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Just keep your hands up. 5. So I can see 5 at the moment. Can I take the 3 in this corner? 1, 2, 3, and then I'll come back over there and over there. Yeah. So we'll take 3 and then next 2.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the lecture tonight. I'm Rhys Higgins from New Scientist. I just wanted to get your take, or at least advice, to give to those that are recruiting or trying to retain key talent in science and engineering during what you've described as an uncertain time.
Yep.
Can I take the next 2?
So just so I'm clear, what advice I would give to those who are... Right, okay. Right.
Jeff Rooker from the House of Lords.
Hello, Jeff.
And 50 years membership of IET, by the way, so I've got 2 hats on. And one of the Lords' EU committees this week made very good use of the latest journal from IET on waste and what's happening in Europe. And my question to you, Hilary, is political. Absolutely right, you made the cornerstone of democracy. Absolutely clear, the result has to be accepted. But the other cornerstone of democracy is we have elections when people can change their mind. So why cannot the case be made in due course when the final decision's made that it's put back to the British people, you wanted to leave, do you still want to leave on these terms?
Ivor Tucker from a company called Imperibox. Two questions. Firstly, just as a layman, what role does the select committee actually have in terms of the detailed negotiations? You say that you get representations all the time, and I'm sure you must do. There's a vast amount of information, almost information overload, I'm sure. What is the practical reality of what all that information and representations will be in terms of the actual negotiations that take place? And the second question around that is, Labour has been quite critical of the government's approach to the negotiations, but they haven't made it at all clear as to what you would do differently to break the impasse at the moment in terms of Ireland and money.
Yeah, okay. Right. Well, I'm not sure. I wouldn't want to seek to give people advice. I'd just point out certain facts. The first is we obviously remain in the European Union until March 2019. Secondly, if we get the transitional arrangement that the Prime Minister is asking for, free movement will continue to operate until the end of the transition period. And linking to your question, sir, in effect, the Prime Minister is asking for what Keir Starmer set out on behalf of the Labour Party in his article in The Observer in August, which is a transition period. Now, Keir then says, let's leave open what happens afterwards. Now, my personal view, it's not the Select Committee's, it's not the Labour Party's policy currently, I think we should stay in the Customs Union. I think it's a profound mistake, in part because it would at least go some way to dealing with the problem of Northern Ireland, which is going to create a real difficulty. There are people about Northern Ireland who say, well, even if we don't get a deal, well, we won't want to put any barriers in place. You're not telling me the Republic of Ireland would put barriers in place to goods and checks and so on, completely failing to understand that that will then be, in those circumstances, the external land border of the European Union. And the 27 have a set of rules which apply at all of the external borders, and the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic would be no different in those circumstances. And the reason why this is so important is because the Good Friday Agreement was in part built on the foundation of the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland being in the European Union. It's one of the co-guarantors to the agreement. And given the astonishing progress that has been made since it was signed 20 years ago. You know, I grew up in London when the IRA were letting off bombs. And if you'd said to me then, don't you worry, Hilary, you will see Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley sitting side by side as Deputy First Minister and First Minister in a power-sharing executive, I would have said to you at that time, I really don't think that's going to happen. It did, because it shows the power of politics, compromise, courage, leadership to bring about profound change. We do not want to jeopardize it as a result of the referendum result. And secondly, the advice I would give is, well, go and talk to the Home Office, because, of course, they are busy crafting what a new immigration policy might look like. All we know at the moment is there was a leaked document a few months back, and the government said, well, that's a working draft and we haven't decided yet, because we will be faced with a very fundamental choice on the issue that you've raised. Who's going to come and pick the vegetables? Who's going to be caring for us on the hospital wards? Who's going to be lecturing at the universities? Who's going to be designing the new materials? All of the things. And I met many people in the referendum who said, I'm voting leave, but I don't think immigration can or should stop. I just want to have a bit of control. And in a funny sort of way, if you then begin to debate how many visas should be given or work permits for nurses, the moment a shortage of visas or work permits results in operations being cancelled at the LGI and Jimmy's, I bet you my constituents will say to me as their local MP, can't you get the government to increase the number? And so the debate about immigration has come home to look at exactly the relationship between need and how we meet it, as well as the social care example I gave earlier. Now, Jeff, I think the difficulty with a second referendum is simply this. We've had one. People made their decision. I haven't seen, frankly, any evidence that there has been a significant change of mind on the part of the British public. The other difficulty is that Europe has a bit of a history of saying to countries when there were referenda on treaty changes, Ireland's had the experience, we didn't like quite the result, could you go away and do your homework again and come back and vote a different way next time? And I think that's kind of part of the problem. Now, who knows what the future holds? The battle at the moment is this. The government has finally had to concede that there will be separate primary legislation to implement the withdrawal agreement. They gave way in the face of Dominic Grieve's amendment. What is not yet clear is how Parliament expresses a view if the government comes back and says we can't get a deal or we're happy to leave without a deal, because that would be a disaster. Now, in those circumstances, I would say, government, here's fresh instructions, go back in. Say, I'm really sorry for wasting your time. We'd like to stay in the customs union, for example. So we have between us, in the Commons and the Lords, to find a means of ensuring that in those circumstances, a vote of Parliament is meaningful. That's what this debate is about. But I'm convinced that certainly in the House of Commons, and I'm sure the same is true in the House of Lords, there is simply not a majority of MPs who are prepared to sanction leaving with no deal. And if there isn't, then it's up to Parliament to exercise its sovereignty, a word I've talked about a lot, in order to make sure that that does not happen. What can the Select Committee do? Well, we produce our reports, we seek to influence the government. I'll give you some examples. I'm not claiming credit and saying what the Select Committee said was the factor that swung it. We early on said you're going to need transitional arrangements. Now, that was hotly contested by people. Brexiteers said, oh, transitional arrangements. That sounds like you're going to keep us in forever. Oh, that's a cunning plan. I'm not going for that. It was obvious we were going to need transitional arrangements. The government eventually adopted that as a policy. The Prime Minister said, well, Brexit means Brexit. And when follow-up questions were asked, she said, I'm not giving you a running commentary. I beg your pardon? We said you need a white paper on what on earth it is you're going to be seeking in the negotiations. Eventually, they produced a white paper. We said Parliament should have a vote. I questioned the Prime Minister just under a year ago in front of the Liaison Committee. She wouldn't commit to giving us a vote. The government then moved. Now, that's not just because of what the Select Committee did. It's pressure that comes from many different quarters. We are now trying to keep tabs on the negotiations, to publish reports. We published a report last week on aspects of the EU withdrawal bill. And we are, I think as you said, Sarah, in your kind introduction, we are the principal body on behalf of Parliament that is seeking to hold the government to account. And we do that in all the ways that select committees do. We were in Brussels 2 weeks ago and had an hour and a half with Michel Barnier to understand where the European Union is coming from, and we'll keep going. But I wouldn't be telling you the truth if the politics of Brexit don't affect the work of the Select Committee in the same way as it affects the work of Parliament, because those arguments still have great force and strength, which is why the nation was so deeply divided on two sides when it came to polling day.
It's really interesting hearing you talk about some of the internal workings of Parliament, and I've noticed in talking to backbench MPs in recent months that you see a spectrum of views held by different individual MPs, from the hard Brexiteers to the kind of, well, I didn't like the result, but we must make the best of it, to the, well, actually, we need to stop it at all costs. And it appears to me, I'm obviously as no way as experienced as you, but it appears to me somewhat of an unusual time where individual MPs have quite different material positions, even within parties. I just wondered if you could reflect a little on that. Is it particularly unusual? Does this happen really quite commonly? And I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on the nature of how these positions are being worked, perhaps through different mechanisms like select committees, but perhaps across party lines.
Well, look, to tell the truth, Europe as an issue has shown its capacity over decades to divide political parties. Now, when Jeff and I reflect on the run-up to the 1974 elections and the 1975 referendum, it was the Labour movement that was irredeemably split on Europe. By about 2 to 1, the Labour Party and the trade union movement was opposed to us having joined in the first place, and wanted to get out of the common market in the referendum. And Harold Wilson, in order to manage the difficulties in the party, said, OK, we'll have a referendum, we'll have a renegotiation, and then the government will make a recommendation. And he did, and he won the referendum. The British people voted 2-1 to remain in the common market. And that was 4 years ago. And then opinion in the Labour Party changed. And the one moment I would pinpoint on that journey that had the biggest impact was Jacques Delors, the then president of the Commission, coming to the TUC conference at a time when Mrs. Thatcher was busy stripping out trade union rights, attacking trade unions, and Jacques Delors came and said, brothers and sisters, I lay before you a vision of a social Europe. And suddenly people twigged, aha, we can get things from Europe that we're never going to get in a million years from Mrs. Thatcher. And remember, the Working Time Directive brought in for the first time in the history of this country a statutory right to paid holiday for everyone. Didn't exist before. Now, for historical reasons, the trade union movement didn't really fancy the law getting involved in industrial relations because all of its experience had been the law was used to oppress workers. But suddenly they realised, actually, we can secure rights. The judgment of the European Court of Justice that meant that about 450,000 workers in women, mainly part-time women workers, had the right to join an occupational pension scheme, a case brought by a British trade union. And opinion changed. And at the time of the referendum in 2016, Labour solidly united, with one or two exceptions, in support of staying in the European Union. The Conservatives, 1972, the European Communities Act is passed, Ted Heath takes us in 73, absolutely solidly in favour of Europe. The intervening 44 years pass, and now we find the Conservative Party absolutely riven, the cabinet absolutely riven by disputes over Europe and Brexit. And the second thing I would say to you, Sarah, is this. One of the consequences of that is, I think we've all made new friends on the other side of the chamber. Because if you look at some of the amendments that have been put down to the European Union withdrawal bill, you see cross-party working, because that reflects that on top of normal Labour, Tory, Lib Dem, Scott Nat politics, lying on top of it now is Brexit politics. And that is quite something to see, because it creates alliances that are not the ones that you would normally expect, given the traditional back and forth of party politics. And that provides an opportunity. It's a challenge, certainly a challenge for the government, because it's sitting there with a very small majority thinking, crumbs, if we don't move on this, we might lose. And that is why we're going to have a separate bill to implement the withdrawal agreement, because they thought they'd lose.
Thank you. Andrew, was it you with your hand up? Yeah. If you take a microphone over to the back. Yeah, I'll go to Andrew, and then, yeah, we're going down just here on the left.
Hello, Andrew Mackenzie from the Physiological Society. Do you think that Britain out of the EU can ever be as successful as Britain in the EU, or do you think this entire process is more about damage limitation?
Here's quite interesting. Another version on that is that we, as an organisation, are always asked by government to present not only the challenges but the opportunities, which, many of us in the room have tried very hard to do that.
Daniel Cressy from Research Fortnight. I wonder if you could give us your impression of how well the concerns of scientists are reaching Parliament as a whole, and how well those concerns are faring amongst your colleagues who don't normally think about science, as they're kind of besieged from a whole bunch of different sectors with different concerns.
I'll just take those two for now.
Oh, okay.
That's right. And then could you raise your hand if you have a question at the moment, then I'll see who we've got. I can see, one there.
Well, Andrew, to answer your question, of course, having campaigned really hard to stay in, I find it very hard to imagine that it's going to be beneficial. Indeed, that's what I said when I spoke to you earlier. I do think, in some respects, it is about damage limitation. A colleague said to me the other day, he said, Hilary, we're engaged in trying to rescue the valuables from the burning building. And I think that's quite a good summary of where we are at the moment. The consequence is that we have given up one of the voices that gives us some influence in the world. Now, we remain a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We're a leading nation in the Commonwealth. We have other relationships all around the globe. But I think we are diminished because we have separated ourselves from this important relationship in a world in which power blocks of influence, are increasingly important. I know from having led the UK delegation at the 2007 climate change talks in Bali, it was really quite powerful for us as the member states to turn up and say, here's the European offer. This is what we're prepared to do. Because that is a great encouragement to others to say, crumbs, that's what Europe's going to do. What about us? Strength in numbers. It's pretty basic. It's pretty obvious. But I'm also passionate about trying to ensure that we maintain as much of a relationship with the European Union, even though we're leaving. So I mentioned foreign policy, defence, security, the fight against terrorism. We absolutely have the same interest in continuing that cooperation. Now, I hope that structural questions, coming back to the point that was raised earlier, won't get in the way of that. Because if you take the example of Russia, the fact that when Russia invaded eastern Ukraine, which is what it did, the European Union said with one voice, including Britain, I'm sorry, but there's a consequence to that, and we agreed on sanctions, well, that sends a powerful signal. It has an impact. I have no doubt that President Putin thought, well, if Britain leaves the European Union, that will weaken Europe, and that will increase my strength. I want a really good relationship with Russia, but Russia needs to understand that there are certain norms in the world, and invading a country and lying about the fact that your troops are in there by taking off their epaulets and then having to explain to their mums when they come back dead that actually there were Russian troops in eastern Ukraine is, as they say, a bit of a problem. And therefore, I hope that we can find a way of maintaining cooperation in those areas precisely because it is in our mutual self-interest. Secondly, well, I tried to answer your question earlier when Sarah put it to me at the beginning. You'd have to ask, I suppose, other parliamentarians about the extent to which they have heard the views of science. There's a lot of work, as CaSE knows very well, that goes on in Parliament to promote science. I think it's improved a great deal in recent years. You think of the Links Day, you think of the occasions when students come from all over the country to display the products of their research with those wonderful posters. And I always try and go around and find the students from Leeds and learn about whatever it is that they are doing. But you just have to keep it up on a regular basis, writing to your individual member of parliament. Handwritten letter, personalised email is much better, frankly, than 500, although 500 emails that have been generated by CaSE or somebody else give you a sense of the weight of opinion. Although I got one the other day, it said, Dear Hilary, Benn, I want you to do whatever it was. And then in square brackets, it said, insert personal experience here, close square brackets. So if you are doing that, can I gently advise you as a recipient, put in your personal experience or delete the square brackets, because it makes a slightly better impression. And by the way, please bear with us, because I try, like I'm sure most MPs, to reply to every one of my constituents who writes to me. But when you open the inbox of the morning and there's 500 emails on a particular subject, it can take a little time for the wonderful people who work with us and support us. So keep it up. And don't assume that just because you know what all the issues are, that everybody else does, because there are a lot of voices and they're quite loud and it's a bit confusing. And when it comes to the negotiators, they are going to have to focus their minds on what they think the really important things are for each stage of the negotiations. And the number one priority for now, when we get through to phase 2, which I hope and pray we will in December, is the transition arrangements. That is the only thing that the UK should focus on to start with, because unless we secure that, then the consequence I talked about will begin to follow, and that will not be good for anybody, including science and engineering.
Thank you. My husband bought me a watch for my birthday. It's here. I'm supposed to look at it, but I haven't done the job properly. And I see that we've kept you rather long. When I asked for hands up, there were 6 hands that went up, which is quite a lot of questions. And I don't know if our hosts are keen to get us out the door. Does anyone know if we need to? Would you be able to bear with us for 5 more minutes?
Of course I can bear with you, but can I just say, if anyone needs to go, please, just when you need to go, and don't feel bashful because we're still going on. Anyway, yeah. No, of course.
Sorry. So if you can forgive me, 6 people who put your hands up, I think I might just take 3. I'm really sorry, but I think 6 is maybe a few too many. So I'm really sorry, but if you had your hand up for the 6, just stick it up again, and I'm going to pick 3 of you, and I really apologise if I didn't pick you. But are you able to stay for a drink with us afterwards?
I will.
Well, then maybe if you're...
Yeah.
If
So
you're
why don't we make an offer to the 3 who don't get picked, come up afterwards, and to the gentleman at the back, I want to continue the conversation because I did mention Russia, and I did mention the United States of America, and I did mention the conflict in Syria. I'm just, you can see I'm feeling a bit sensitive given what you said, but I think that's not a fair reflection. But
no,
anyway.
I didn't think it was.
But
I'm sure that you're used to it. A bit of a challenging question from the other side of the floor.
Right, onward.
Yeah. So can I go 1, 2, 3, and to the other 3 of you, I apologise.
But come up afterwards. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Adrian de Suter. I'm from Goldsmiths, University of London. So I'm one of the 3 million EU citizens that have called the UK home for the past 20 years. I'm also an early career researcher in the process of completing a PhD. And you've spoken at length about trying to find ways to avoid perhaps a bit of a talent drain that might occur once the UK leaves the EU. And I myself, given the experience, have made a decision that following my PhD, I will leave the country. And the truth is a lot of damage has already been done. Key amongst this has been the government's position on saying that our rights are even up to negotiation.
So can you just say that last point again? The government's position on?
On saying that our rights are up for negotiation.
Oh, yes, saying the right. Yeah, fine.
So my question to you is what, if anything, can be done to undo that damage? In short, what would you say to me and other people like me? What would stop us from leaving?
Yeah.
Alan, and if I could ask you just to make the questions fairly quick.
Alan Malcolm, sometime door knocker in North Ealing. In response to your reply to Jeff Rooker, you said you'd see no evidence of any shift in British opinion.
Yep.
500,000 Brexiteers have died since the referendum. and nobody has asked their opinion, and they have been replaced by 500,000 16 and 17-year-olds whom we know would have voted Remain from every poll there is. Can you admit that after Christmas, the referendum result will be different?
The thing about scientists, they're very numerate, you see. And the last, one more. Last one down here.
Hi there, Tom Livermore here from the Academy of Medical Sciences. So I was, I'd like to thank you for your speech this evening and echo what Sarah said about having someone the value of having someone coming from outside the sector to come and speak to us. And so my question kind of stems from that. And it's related to your point about the possibility, or you're advocating a possible means of freedom of movement for researchers, much like that which was proposed for bankers. And I think one thing which would make many in the room nervous about that is this, although we might agree with it, is this idea that there's special pleading which comes along with it. And I'd just like to get your reflections on how well the scientific community is framing its arguments to ensure that they're landing as well as possible with all audiences, not just parliamentarians, and that it doesn't come across as special pleading or self-serving arguments.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Adrian, all I would say is I'm really sorry to hear that you've decided to go, and I would say to you, please don't, because I understand entirely how many of the European citizens looked at the referendum result. Look, we'd all feel like that. We'd say, so you don't like us, you don't want us here anymore. We take it personally, of course we do. But that doesn't represent everybody, first point. Secondly, I disagree, as you know, with the government taking your future into the negotiations, although the reason I said that there's no question at all but that the 3 million are going to stay is because, of course, you're all going to stay. Now, there are questions outstanding, portability of social security rights, the rights for Brits to vote in local election in other European countries, because the British government has said European citizens can continue to vote in local elections here. I wish the European Union would mirror that commitment. When I raised it with someone from the Commission, they said, but that's a bilateral matter between Britain and the other member states. And I said, come off it. It's not a bilateral matter. Follow the lead. Future rights of family reunion. And that's a big issue. A very big issue. Elderly relatives, children who are in their 20s, who've been studying back home or elsewhere in Europe, wanting to come back. It's also a tricky problem for the British government, because my constituents who are British, who want to bring their elderly relatives and their adult children, it's quite difficult. And the truth about European citizens is that they have had better rights than British citizens living in the United Kingdom. And government has to has to wrestle with that. And the final thing I would say is, for all the reasons I tried to explain tonight, that our future is bound up by continuing to be outward-looking and welcoming. And I met many people in the referendum who would probably be horrified if someone came up to them and said, so you don't like me and you want me to leave, because they would tend to say, no, so-and-so lives next door, wonderful. It's always about others, or it's those who are going to come in the future. And that is not, it seems to me, what the vast majority of British people are, or like, or want. There are some people, but we've got a job on our hands to take them on and make sure that those views don't spread any further, hence my comments about populists and populism. Now, I don't think it's absolutely necessarily the case that the 500,000 would have changed their minds, because they may still be holding to those views in the afterlife. So I'm not sure your theory is absolutely proven. But look, yes, well, you describe a process that is inexorable and will affect us all. I was making a broader point about looking at the opinion polls, such as have been published. There was one that showed 52-48 the other way, but I refer to what I said to Jeff earlier, that I don't see any sign of a substantial change. Of course, we're still in the European Union, and it's only slowly that the consequences will become clear. One is already very clear, which is the decline in the value of sterling, the increase in inflation, which was predicted before the referendum, and it came to pass immediately thereafter, because the world looked at Britain and said, we think you're going to be less valuable in future, because you've taken this strange decision that is not in your economic self-interest, so we're going to mark you down. And it has all sorts of consequences, from the cost of holidays to the fact the MOD's got a big problem with its budget, because it buys kit in dollars, and it's going to buy less kit because of the consequences of Brexit. But that is going to take time to be seen and to be felt. And otherwise, I refer you to the answer that I gave to Jeff earlier on his question. It's a very interesting question that you asked about special pleading. And I wasn't making an argument for special pleading. I was just reflecting the fact I was addressing an audience of scientists and engineers, so I thought I ought to say something about you and your future. But when you talk to the health service, they'll bend my ear about doctors and nurses. And when you go to Boston and Lincolnshire, which is the part of the country where there was the biggest Leave vote, the farmers there will say, well, who's going to be picking the carrots and the vegetables? Because people from Britain long ago gave up wanting to go and do that work. If we trebled the wages to encourage people from Britain to come and do that, it might attract them, but our carrots would be so expensive that Tesco's would say, well, I'm not buying those because I'll buy them from somewhere else. So they're in a bit of a bind, and yet Boston is a place that has seen the biggest and most profound change in terms of its makeup because of the huge number of people, in particular from Eastern Europe, who have come. And on that visit, we learned one thing about property prices and rents, because of the need to house workers who've come from the EU, when a new property comes on the market, a landlord buys it. Local people can't afford the houses. And in Boston, where wages are lower than in the rest of the country, house prices and rents are higher. And so people look at that and say, that doesn't seem like a really good deal for me. Now, that's an example of a housing crisis and a problem with the housing market that you can see reflected in different ways around the country. So, in short, I think it is for each sector of the economy to argue its case with the Home Office, going back to the question that you asked me earlier. And the challenge for the civil servants and the ministers in the Home Office is to work out, we can see all of these needs. The Treasury will be telling them about the needs. BEIS will be telling them about the needs. The NHS, the Department of Health, will be telling them about the needs. How are they going to square this particular circle? And the reason why I'm in favour of having an honest and open conversation about migration is the idea that we can continue to prosper if we slam the door shut is a nonsense for the reasons that I set out. And I think we ought to engage in that conversation with people because, as I tried to indicate earlier, once we are faced with the consequence of not having sufficient number of people, and we should train as many folk from home, I think in the construction sector, there's a wonderful opportunity and a responsibility on the construction sector to start training some people. Because I'm fed up, frankly, with building firms when there's a boom saying, oh, we can't find any brickies or plasterers or chippies. Have you thought of training some? Instead of relying on the training undertaken by other countries. Because you'd never find Rolls-Royce saying, we've got big order for new Trent engines. Do you know what? We haven't got any engineers to build them. They wouldn't do that. So think about your own future as an industry and train. But I think we have the opportunity to have a proper conversation about immigration, and I think most people, including those who voted leave, will be up for a sensible policy, but each industry and sector has to make its voice heard. It's not special pleading for you, it's about what you think is important for the sector in which you work and which you're so proud of.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. I'm going to take the privilege of having a little wrap-up question before we let you off the stage. I think you've talked a lot about, in contrast to that earlier question about not talking about the whole world, I think you've actually talked about this dialogue and communication and the role of the UK in institutions that have been formed globally. I think that the scientific and engineering community, its values will not change, and really at the heart of its values are this sort of outward-looking cooperative attitude that underpins both academic research but also industrial endeavours, whether they're to do with supply chains or multinational companies. So I think in a couple of years' time that value will still be central to the community, and one of the challenges is how the actual structural operations will work that allow that to continue. So I wanted to end with a sort of similar question to you, is if you were back here on this stage in 2 years' time, what would be your hope as to Britain's place and its attitude to the rest of the world?
Well, the thing I hope for from the negotiations, and I think it's the best we can hope for at this stage, is we end up with an agreement which consists of, firstly, the divorce arrangements, citizens' rights, money, other things that can be agreed. Secondly, the transitional arrangements, which give us time. And thirdly, I think, if it goes well, there'll be a political declaration to say the EU and the United Kingdom have agreed to negotiate a new association agreement between the two of us covering these things. And it could be a short list, a long list, it could be not much detail, it could be more detail. And then that keeps the door open to determining the future relationship. And if a deal like that appeared, well, I would vote for that if the only alternative is there's no deal at all. So that, I think, is what we need to focus on. Then the question is, what kind of deal are we seeking? Because we still don't know what the government wants. We don't. Deep, special partnership. It's what I call the Goldilocks approach to negotiating. We want a deal that's not too hard or too soft, too hot or too cold. We want a deal that's just right. Well, that's fine, but you need to start spelling out what it is, because it will then make clear what choices you are prepared to make as a government about what we're prepared to give in order to get a deal in return. And that's why I made the point about the European Court of Justice, because if staying in the European Aviation Safety Authority meant us having to accept that the ECJ would adjudicate in the very small number of cases where decisions are challenged, I'm struggling to see the great threat to British sovereignty as a result of doing that. For crying out loud, be sensible. Secondly, I hope very much, as I said in answer to the earlier question, that we have negotiated a way of continuing to work together with our European friends and neighbours on foreign policy, defence, security and the fight against terrorism, because that would show that despite this separation, institutionally, that we recognise we have this common interest, and that would enable Britain to continue to have influence and to make its voice heard, above all by the strength of our economy and our science base, our arguments and our values, and our ability to work on things. At the moment, however, all energy is being sucked into Brexit, and that makes it more difficult to turn our face outwards and do other things. So trying to conclude that so we can get back to playing our role in the world without having to worry about Brexit, I'd like to see that very much, but we have to get a decent deal to make that happen.
Thank you very much. Please will you join me in thanking very warmly our speaker, Right Honourable Hilary Benn. And
hello everyone, my name is Graham Reid and I'm chairman of the Campaign of Science for Science and Engineering, and I just wanted to say a few words of thanks to bring this evening almost to a close. There are many words spoken about Brexit, but it's only when the speaker has experience at the cabinet table, on the front bench of the opposition, and in chairing arguably the country's most important select committee, that you get the breadth of perspective, the depth of understanding, and the all-round wit and wisdom that we've enjoyed this evening from Hilary Benn. I think it's been a privilege, and I hope that you share my view that we've all been very fortunate to sit through it. But this evening would not have happened without some other people, and I would just like to mention them as well. First of all, to the Institution of Engineering and Technology, who have been such wonderful hosts this evening and have allowed us the use of this marvellous lecture theatre. Thanks very much to the President, Nick Windsor, for laying this on for us. Secondly, to Sarah and the team at CaSE, who do such a lot every day of every week to represent the interests of the science and engineering community in government and in Parliament at this most delicate of all times, when we depend so much on an effective interface between science and politics. And finally, to the members of CaSE who make the whole operation possible. CaSE has a uniquely broad membership that includes global corporations, universities, colleges, professional institutions, research charities, research institutes, trade unions, and hundreds of individual members. And it's their combined support that make it possible for CaSE to exist. And finally, of course, I'd like to thank you for being such a wonderful audience. In fact, you've been such a wonderful audience that we're going to give you a glass of wine afterwards. So stay on, enjoy us for that, and thank you again for joining us this evening.